Okay, and we are back. Sorry about that. We had just a glitch there where my program got disconnected. We had to restart. We're back with part two of horror writing for TV, and we're wrapping up talking about ghouls or sources of threats in your show. Basically, those boil down to human evil, emotional pain, or a cold and uncaring universe, as I call it, which is referring to either cosmic horror existential threats or maybe natural threats or things that we just can't really relate to or understand very well. It's kind of like the sources are you, me, or everything else. The unknown. Or the unknowable. I see a question in the chat. Does Twin Peaks count as horror? Twin Peaks has scary parts here and there, yeah. It's definitely like a creepy, surrealist mystery with a horror-ish tone at times. But Twin Peaks is a lot of things. So, let's look at genres and subgenres. Okay, so we have, to begin with, your sci-fi, which Stranger Things is probably the most popular sci-fi horror show out there. This is stuff involving alternate dimensions, aliens. Sometimes psychic powers can be presented in a sci-fi way, and sometimes they're more fantasy-ish. But there's a show, what's it called? There's an alien universe-based TV show coming out on FX, which should be cool. We have supernatural or religious, or sometimes called paranormal, which can be linked to those things. And paranormal is more like in the urban fantasy kind of world of vampires and werewolves and psychics and stuff like that. But supernatural religious can include possession, demons, angels, vampires, any of those above, mixed however you want. We have cosmic horror or Lovecraftian. That's going to include unknowable entities and madness and things like this, as well as some more specific tropes that kind of like sum up to ultimately having this Lovecraftian vibe. It's largely going to come down to that unknowability of the threats that we're against. Like, we can't possibly even begin to grasp what these things are or why they're doing this, or things like Uzumaki on Adult Swim is a cosmic horror show. We have horror comedy. Needs to have actual scary parts. I mentioned this in the last bit, but if it's just a comedy in a Halloween-ish setting, it is not really a horror comedy, at least by my definitions. We have to have actual scary parts too. So Buffy has some horror comedy vibes to it. Ash vs. Evil Dead. We have what's it called? There's one that I liked. Was it called Stand vs. Evil? We have there was one called The Strange Calls, which was sort of a low-key, spooky Australian mystery that I liked. Let's look at some more. We have Mystery Box, which we mentioned before. That's kind of like it's a mystery genre show that expands the scope of the mysteries with every answer that we discover, to the point where we're kind of like unraveling vast conspiracies or huge crazy questions or things like this. So they can have, slasher on TV can have that kind of vibe sometimes as well. We have post-apocalypse, Walking Dead, Last of Us, zombies, historical or gothic, and that is going to be your Penny Dreadfuls, your The Terror, things like this, that, or, Haunting of Bly Manor. And these are going to be stories set in the past. They could be the recent past or the distant past. There's a Korean zombie show, I think, called Kingdom, which is on Netflix, which is pretty cool. And then we have ensemble drama, which it can fit. It's almost that's not really tied to the subject matter as much as like the way that the story is told. But I'm just going to call this the like Flanagan genre, because he has so many horror shows and he's basically a genre in and of himself. These are like big tearjerker dramas with lots of characters and lots of perspectives and POVs that usually have that supernatural ghost kind of theme to them. Okay, so let's go into this. Oh, and let me actually go back one slide. So did I miss anything? Is there any subgenre that you guys like that I did not touch upon?
Did you do fantasy horror?
I did not specifically. I thought about it. I did not specifically include it. Just, I guess, because most of what we would define as fantasy horror is going to be in the historical gothic space, or
Actually,
the
all
supernatural.
horror is sort of fantasy in a way.
Well,
except for serial killer.
Yeah, that's the one big thing, is that like Hannibal is not fantastical, but it takes place in a crazy world with tons of serial killers, right? So you don't need supernatural for it to be horror, but I would say about 80% of horror is supernatural in some way.
Got it. Yeah.
Go ahead, Becky.
It's not specifically genre, but there's a really big market out there at the moment. Obviously, I always talk about kids stuff. For like kids horror, but I say older kids, so like teen. The Goosebumps recently becoming a TV show, them rehashing the Midnight Society, the Are You Afraid of the Dark? That's making a big comeback, and of course, what's special about that is that they are more focusing on the psychological aspect of the horror rather than the gore.
Right.
Because it's for kids.
Yeah, exactly. I love Goosebumps growing up. Go ahead, Luke.
I was going to ask about psychological horror. Like, are there TV shows that are primarily...
There definitely are. I'm not sure if I would call that... I guess I just didn't consider it, like, a big enough niche to put it up on the board. But, like, Servant, the M. Night Shyamalan TV show on Apple TV, it does have supernatural elements, but it is very... Like, it makes you kind of question every character's psychology. It's kind of one of those setups where it's like, there's 3 main characters, and for a while we're like, oh, one of them's crazy. Then after a while we're like, wait, no, that one's crazy. Then after a while we're like, wait, no, they're all crazy. Then after a while we're like, wait, no, none of them are crazy. The world's just supernatural. Then we're like, no, it's not. Like, so I guess, yeah, we can definitely explore that too. Bates Motel would be the other big one.
Okay. I guess some of these sort of blend into other genres too, like, what was the example I was just thinking of? Severance. It's not really horror, but it's very psychological.
Right.
And it would blend into the sci-fi horror thing.
Yeah, it is. It has terrible things happening in it that are existentially terrifying, but it doesn't have scare sequences. And so for something to be in the actual horror genre, you need to have scare sequences. Not deaths, mind you. You don't have to kill. You don't have to have characters actually dying for the show to be scary. Go ahead.
Also, you can have shows that I'm trying to think. I'm thinking of like Doctor Who, where some episodes are funny, some episodes are mysterious, but then when they do horror, I mean, it's still a family thing, so it's not, again, like nothing's gory, but when they do horror, God, they do horror. You know, generations of kids hiding behind the sofas because of the angels, the weeping angels, or like the House with Rondo, and you know, and all of that. So I'm interested in shows that kind of explore different genres within their like confines.
Yeah, you often talked about Supernatural, which is a similar sort of like, I guess we'd call them everything and the kitchen sink kind of shows, where it's like, you could do an alien in one of them, you could do a zombie in the next one, you just do whatever you want.
Supernatural is a brilliant example because it's and it's a brilliant example of how to keep the flow going. Because if you're binge watching it, you know, you'll have this really depressing episode that's all about like death and this ghost boy and him having to move on to let his family move on, and then you have this really funny episode. And you know, I mean, they did an episode where they went into a cartoon of Scooby-Doo, you know.
Yeah, I had an ex that was really, really, really into it, and so I ended up having to watch a few episodes. The one where there's like a bunch of evil Muppets, basically, and was this Angel or was this Supernatural? There's like a sort of children's show that's like haunted or something, and so all the Muppet puppet characters are like killing people. And I think this was Angel actually, and the main character gets turned into a puppet at some point. Yeah, Angel probably also falls into that everything and also the kitchen sink kind of space.
Yeah.
Is Under the Dome, is that psychological horror?
I haven't actually seen it, but my understanding is that it is more about the survival situation than it is about the character's psychology, but maybe somebody who has seen it would have to tell me.
Gotcha.
Okay, let's look at this idea of lulling the audience. So we're going to read a few pages from Scream. And somebody says, I'm passionate about kids' horror. Bring back stuff like Courage. Oh, funny, you should mention it. You mean my favorite show as a kid? I have a whole slide on Courage.
May I take this opportunity then to plug the new group on WordCamp that's starting up on Saturday, that's for people who want to write for kids. TV, film, books, all the works from like picture book right up to YA. on Saturday at, oh God, my times have changed. So it's after Joel's disability workshop
Okay.
and before your class.
Before my class on Saturdays, before the novel class?
Yeah,
Okay, got it. So probably 11 a.m. on Pacific time, I would guess.
that sounds about right.
We can double check that and make an actual announcement, though. Thank you for that, Becky. Okay, so let's go. Let me zoop back here. So let's look at this idea of lulling the audience. And so the nice thing about Scream is that it always has a character that is sort of meta. They're not aware they're in a movie or show, but the idea within Scream that we are constantly reflecting on the genre, the tropes, the expectations, and kind of the differences from the last entry in the franchise. That's always just leads to a nice way for the writers to sort of spell out what the theme of this movie, episode, or whatever it is. So in the pilot of Scream, there's this big question as to, like, how could horror work on TV, or especially, how could a slasher work on TV? Isn't a slasher based on a bunch of characters die? Well, if we kill all the characters in the first episode, we run out of characters, and you don't have any characters left to be in the show. And they kind of bring this up when I forget the exact context in which the character's talking about this. I don't remember if they're talking about an in-universe show, but often, because within the world of Scream, they are usually making movies about the events that are happening, and it leads to, like, an easy way for the characters to talk about the actual events as if they are movies. It's a little complicated, but anyway, let's read what this character has to say about how can slashers work on TV, or how can, let's say, horror with a high body count work on TV. What does Noah tell us? He says, you got to remember the whodunit may not be as important in this sort of story. The question is, so it's more like a why done it? No, I'm saying you need to forget that it's a horror story, that someone might die at any turn. And then you can see this is like one of those montages where we have that voiceover that sort of persists, the audio continues over these shots that we're seeing. You have to care if the smart, pretty girl forgives the dumb jock. You have to care if the team wins the big game. You have to care if the brilliant, misunderstood guy gets up the nerve to ask the popular girl out. And I like Riley's response here. That sounds like Friday Night Lights. He's like, exactly. You root for them, you love them, so when they are brutally murdered, it hurts. Makes sense, right? Like, in fitting the format, like, of a slasher from one single episode to 10 episodes, or 20 or 50 episodes, we have to allow other things to matter. Like, it can't be an entire story about characters that are trapped in a house being stalked by a killer for years of TV. That just doesn't make sense. That situation just, like, would not last that long. Given how long an average amount of TV covers. Like, even if it was in real time, it wouldn't last for years. So you have to find character relationships that you can push forward that really matter and that we get invested in. You have to give your characters interesting goals. Like, basically we're saying you have to write it well, but the specific things to be paying attention to are things like the non-horror stuff, I guess, matters as much or more than the horror stuff, because we won't care about the horror stuff unless we first care about those characters and their goals, their ambitions, and the other things that are, like, other scales of conflict that are going on in the world at the same time. So your subplots are going to be really key towards building out this world, and in a sense, lulling us to forgetting that it's horror. Or, like, we don't really forget, but, like, yes, your body kind of forgets as you're watching it. Your mind might know in some way that, yeah, no, I know what the title of the show is, you know, Cheerleader Massacre or whatever. I know there's going to be murders in this. But in watching this, it feels like we're watching a drama for a little bit, or maybe a comedy for a little bit. We sort of forget. Let's recap continuity. Premise versus status quo. Premise is more like a long movie. We need to watch the episodes in order to follow the story. The characters change more over the course of multiple seasons. And essentially, every episode is just a chapter of a longer story. Your pilot is chapter 1 of a longer story that you almost certainly will not get to write the entire thing. Status quo is just the term I use to refer to episodes that reset to the characters back to how things were. Status quo is, you know, the way things were. You can tune into any episode, any season, and still follow the story of the episode, and the characters change very little or not at all. The story engine, to recap this, is an amalgamation of several elements that are going to sum up to create that conflict in your show that will sustain many episodes of a theoretical series. We mentioned if you're doing miniseries, this works totally differently, so, like, distinguish those very much in your mind. But in most shows, you want your premise, or you want the engine to be clear from the series logline, because we're looking at two different loglines for TV shows. We have a series, which kind of clarifies what we're doing over the arc of the entire show, And then we have a pilot logline, which is telling us just what we're doing in this very first episode. Altogether, this engine is going to fuse your character's story world and situations to continually generate recurring conflict. A strong story engine is going to suggest potentially hundreds of hours of TV, or you could suggest like the scope and scale of the show that you're aiming for. Like, if this would last a couple years, then you want to make it sound like a conflict that would last a couple years. So we're asking questions like, what is unique about these characters? What do they want? Why should we watch them want it or pursue it? We want to have characters that we're either very badly rooting for or very badly rooting against, but you don't want the middle ground. That's like death. What's the world of the show and the unique types of people that inhabit it? How do new people intersect with the main characters? Like, are you continually introducing new ones, or is this one really stable cast? You can balance those things however you like, but that sort of answers the question of how the story engine is working. You can think of some of our like standbys and go-tos for story engines still work in horror. Profession. The protagonist has a job that gives them a license to intervene in other characters' lives. And that works great for shows like Hannibal or X-Files, where we have a case of the week or killer of the week. We're going from scary, like that gives your characters a perfect excuse for why are we always running into scary stuff. Well, it's our job to find it. Like, we go seek out scary stuff, and we intentionally combat, capture, defeat, exercise, or anything else. Could be solving crimes, treating patients. A show like Garth Marenghi's Dark Place is I guess it is a straight comedy, not horror, but it sort of purports to be horror at least, but that's like a hospital procedural set in a hospital that is built over the entrance to hell. It is very funny. Helping clients. Maybe you have is there a horror lawyer show? Can someone do Better Call Scary Saul? Is there something there? Domestic servants, aristocrats, teachers, students, bosses. Go ahead.
There's a good TV show called The Real Estate. I thought it was an interesting concept. It's basically ghost hunters under the rise of a real estate business. So they shift the houses that are otherwise difficult to shift because people don't want it because they get the bad vibe because it's got ghosts in it. So they basically get the ghosts to move on before they can then sell the house.
That's an unscripted show, or that's a scripted show?
It's a scripted show.
Oh, okay. I could also see that premise being done as one of those, like Ghost Hunter, like, there's a ton of those shows out there. There's we're not even going to talk about them because it would take us down such a tangent, but it's like, I guess we would mostly call them the Ghost Hunter genre, or the Cryptid Hunter genre. If you find Bigfoot, the show's over, so you never find him. You basically just mess around in the woods if you want to make one of those shows. Okay, we have a unifying goal or problem. That's actually much more common than Profession, but it works really well also in the world of horror. Pulls other characters into the protagonist's life as we are all dealing with the same thing, maybe because it affects everyone equally, or it could be that one of your characters has a problem that others just get pulled into their orbit sort of thing. Like Marianne is a little bit like that, and some Stephen King media has that kind of vibe too. We might be fighting against or working together to survive an apocalypse, fighting against the forces of that apocalypse or whatever, or trying to collaborate against it. We might have rivalries or arguments or alliances to cope with our setting that we're in, but ultimately your characters are all trying to do the same thing or some version of the same thing. Maybe they're all competing for the same thing. That can work too really well. Or they are collaborating to get the thing. There could be multiple factions of characters that are all trying to get the same thing. But in any case, that battle for power or control is usually going to be at the heart of this, whether that is we're all trying to solve the same mystery to regain control of our lives, because if we don't solve this mystery, we're going to die, or we will some other bad thing will happen. Or it could be about control of a business or a kingdom or something like this. That's usually not the basis for a horror show, because remember, the hook is usually the threat, but maybe it could be. Maybe we're fighting against the skeleton kingdom or something like that. A show like Castlevania, I think, has that sort of vibe to it. So I don't need to go too deep into this slide. I will just mention this is not like incredibly unique to horror, but high school or college settings are still pretty common in the horror space, especially in that sort of slasher, ironic teen Scream kind of world of shows like Scream, which we just mentioned. I will just suggest to consider that there's a short expiration date on this kind of story engine, because your characters will simply age out of the show, unless you're Glee, in which case they're somehow in high school for like 10 years, I guess. Some high school shows were popular, but then have to sort of pivot to this different story world. So like in Glee, they're in high school for a long time, but then after they start leaving, the show has to basically completely change forms. These are not horror things to worry about. And hey, if maybe your solution to this is, well, they get too old, they just die, and then we don't have to worry about them anymore. That can work well. We have shows about families can work very well in horror, especially we see this in the ensemble drama Flanagan type world, right? A Haunting of Hill House and Bly Manor and things like this. Gothic stories can often be centered on individual families, but you can be thinking, is there some problem that is afflicting this family? Does this family have some sort of shared occupation, profession, like goal or something like that? Usually these are about families that are their lives are disrupted by some sort of event that they now have to try to fix in order to get back to normal. Okay, let's look at continuity and story engines. I'm just checking the chat really quick. A couple of suggestions for spooky Better Call Saul. Ugly Americans was a horror lawyer type show. Yep. Immigration Services for Supernatural Creatures. That was an adult cartoon. We have Shasha Dash suggests a lawyer who defends monsters against humans. Like a guy kills his kid and blames it on the chupacabra. Okay, yeah, maybe it could work. Feels a little horror comedy-ish, but I guess maybe because it's kind of inherently absurd to think that human laws mattered in the face of existential horror. You don't need a lawyer, you need a supernatural lawyer. Okay. Is there a version where the lawyer is the threat, I wonder? Just asking. See if you can crack that one. Can you make it work? I mean, lawyer is a serial killer seems like a freebie, but find something besides lawyer is a serial killer. See what you can come up with. Okay, let's look at continuity and story engines. I'm going to check the chat back later to see if anybody was able to crack that one. So we're looking at anthology, status quo, and premise. The one I didn't mention was, anthology, which we're going to crack into in just a moment because this is huge in the world of horror TV. Or I guess it should be huger. But in any case, it makes a lot of sense and works very well, let's just say. So, anthology can be on a seasonal or episodic basis. What that means is that a show like American Horror Story has seasonal anthology format, meaning every season is a self-contained story, in which you even have that sort of theater troupe kind of approach where the same actors play different characters every time, which I love. I wish I liked American Horror Story, but I do love the engine. Anthology, or you might have episodic anthology like Tales from the Crypt or Black Mirror, which not every episode of Black Mirror is horror-themed, but Tales from the Crypt or Creepshow or Darknet is an underrated horror anthology from Canadian TV, I believe, from the mid to late 2000s, I think maybe 2009 or 10. This format works great. And why does it work great? Because the stakes can be as high as you want. You can kill everyone in any episode. Like, no character is safe. You can escalate as much as a movie would. And movies can escalate more because we don't have to keep everything in place or intact in time for the next episode to roll around and for us to pick up those pieces later. There are no pieces to pick up. You can burn the whole house down. It's fine. We might have, to clarify, though, why is this not just a movie? Because if you add 20, 30 pages to it, it could just be a movie. So, like, does it make sense for this to be an anthology as opposed to just a feature that you develop? That's a big question. How can we address that? Well, we need some kind of unifying element. Some sort of theme or topic. Maybe a shared setting or story element. Dark web is a good... or maybe it's darknet, actually, not dark web. But darknet has this idea of the characters are all connected by a website. All the stories are not connected to each other from an episode to episode. Here, let me just explain how Darknet works, because it's brilliant. Okay, Darknet is a Canadian horror anthology that works like this. It is all the characters are linked via this website that it's like a place where you can go and like hire a hitman, or you can go, sometimes people post pictures of supernatural things that they think they see on there, and they're like, who can identify this? It's like a website where spooky stuff happens, essentially. But ultimately, I think almost everything turns out to be not supernatural, and in fact is all mundane. So that's kind of a cool way of seeing how even stuff that initially seems out there actually ends up being mundane at the end of the day. But the really cool thing about the format and how the continuity works is that it's an anthology on an episodic basis, but the stories are sliced up. And it doesn't play one after the other. It'll play a story for a while, and then it'll cut to the next one. And the next one will start, and we won't have any resolution to the first one. And then eventually that second story cuts off before it's done. We start a third one. And then we sort of like splice between them until it all makes sense, and you have the full picture of everything. It's actually really tricky to pull this kind of thing off. I want to give you just an example of how one of my favorite episode was working. So, story A. there's a woman who's at home, and she's alone and kind of lonely, and I think we say her husband... I'm going to butcher this, but let me just tell you what I remember, and then that will be the version we go with, okay? So there's a woman who's home alone. I believe she's either recently divorced or her husband is absent and cold and distant and away or something like that. And she notices there's somebody across the street watching her through his window, like a peeping Tom, right? And she's initially very mortified by that, but sort of starts getting, like, into it in a certain way. She starts doing, like, a sexy striptease for the peeping Tom. You know, husband has abandoned her or whatever, so now is the chance to have a bit of a thrill, right? Then we cut to the next story, and it's about a guy that starts hearing a horrible sound in his apartment. It's like a high-pitched whine, and he's trying to find it, the source of it. Where is it coming from? Is it something electronic? He tears out all the speakers from his computers. He's, like, bashing holes in the walls and stuff like this. He can't figure out where it's coming from, right? And then we go... Oh, God, am I going to remember the third one? So the third one is... Do I have it? No. So let me just tell you how those two sort of wrap up. Later on, like, as we sort of splice these stories together, we come to realize... we eventually realize those are the same story. And the guy hearing the noise in his... The first one just is chronologically later than the bug one. So we find out that the guy, he searches through all his apartment, tears out the walls and stuff. He tells everyone in his family. They all think he's gone nuts. Eventually, he ends up hanging himself. And then the last beat of it is a cockroach crawls out of his ear. There was a bug in his ear canal that was causing the sound. As we wrap that story, we pull back to show the guy hanging from the noose was the peeping Tom. He wasn't actually peeping on her at all. He's hanging there staring across the street at her the whole time. I'm laughing because it's so gleefully brilliant. Cool, right? Like, the stories pay off in ways that surprise you, and that kind of use this idea of our assumptions about the anthology format, our expectations are used against us to surprise us. And that's brilliant. So you can try cool, interesting stuff like that with your anthology. It doesn't always have to work the exact same way. And you have to maybe find something like that website is a brilliant unifying element. And a great way to, like, make these little cameos from one short to the other as we see the ways they kind of intersect. Or maybe we see a post that one character made in an earlier episode on the website in a later episode. Really cool. We might have a shared theme or topic, like they're all stories about this kind of thing, or maybe in the same setting, which is probably a little better. We might have a frame story or some kind of narrative device, like the Crypt Keeper, that he's kind of, like, there's not really a unifying plot element between Creepshow or Tales from the Crypt. They're almost always supernatural, but not every single time. And they do follow, like, a pretty formulaic kind of, like, archetype to them. But that said, this sort of narrator of the Crypt Keeper, and it's like the attitude of the world are almost more the unifying element than the plot themselves. It's like this idea of us kind of cackling at the cruel irony and the way that it plays out these dark fates of these characters. Like, the personality becomes the unifying element. The fact that the Crypt Keeper is the one curating and presenting these stories to us makes it feel like they all come from the same world. They come from his vault or whatever. That's how the comics always used to put it. They're like, here's another one from my vault. Here's a particularly nasty one from my darkest collection. You're going to love this one. It has that kind of vibe to it with all the different narrators from Tales from the Crypt. Because the comics had more than just the Crypt Keeper. We had the Old Witch. This is my favorite comic series of all time, which was a pre-Comics Code series from before 1954, when the Comics Code Authority severely limited what you could do in comic books. This was, like, part of the reason that was created, because they were like, you can't do a comic about playing baseball with human limbs. And yet you can. And they were also like, you can't do comics that are allegories about racism. That would be crazy. Early 50s. Anyway, that's how we can think of anthology on TV. Don't fall into the trap of thinking it always has to follow the exact same structure and format. The pilot needs to feel like somehow more than just a movie, but it's up to you how you manage that. Are there surprising crossovers between episodes, plot elements, or characters, or things like that? Between the segments, or, some thread that connects them? Is there some frame story, narrative device, some shared place all these things are happening in, like something like Night Vale? Think of how does it feel like more than just a movie? Because that'll always be the first development question you get. Can you just add 30 pages to this and we'll do it as a low-budget feature? Like, why are we spending all this money on a show? Okay, hope that makes sense. I'll take questions on all three of these at the end. At the end of this segment of Anthology, Status Quo, and Premise. Let's go into Status Quo, though, first. So, Status Quo means everything resets to the same kind of baseline standard of narrative every episode. And what that means is that can only work in two ways with horror, because remember, horror is about huge stakes and huge threats. So either your threats aren't that bad, something like The Strange Calls I mentioned, kind of like a low-key, sleepy little Australian show. Either that, or you can do a hard reset, shows like Courage. Even dead characters are somehow alive again after every episode. It like pretty much only works in comedic or animated. I would love to see a live-action show do this. I don't think anyone ever has. But like the rule is, even if Eustace gets turned into a chicken at the end of the episode, or squashed by a giant waffle from space, or, you know, possessed by a demon, or buried alive, by the start of the next one, we're back to normal. And it's sort of like there's not really a canon, besides the occasional recurring antagonist that it feels like Courage sometimes remembers from his past encounters, like Cats, the Duck, or like certain other characters. It's kind of like Wallace and Gromit in that way. And then last we have, the last element of this is, so the story engine's usually centered around a place in Status Quo shows. Like we mentioned, this idea of a recurring source of horror rather than a singular threat. It's more about an interesting, spooky location that provides unlimited mysteries and threats. Or it could be about your characters traveling from place to place like Scooby-Doo. Question from Oogler. Do you remember the puppet episode where Eustace and Muriel just straight up have their souls sucked out? It was a season finale. Yeah, something about a season finale does feel a little more definitive as to saying, like, yep, this happened. So it's so dark the way they would do that sometimes. Sometimes Eustace got, like, Eustace almost always got some sort of cathartic, horrible fate, didn't he? Amanda asked, is Scooby-Doo kids horror? Yeah, for sure. Yeah, Scooby-Doo is like, horror comedy for kids.
Okay, so it doesn't have to be scary for it to be horror. It almost sounds like.
Well, I think Scooby-Doo is scary for kids, especially some of the movies they did, like Escape from Zombie Island, which was like traumatic for a lot of kids, and did have
Okay,
actual.
I didn't see the movies.
Okay, so the show, it does have life and death stakes. I think some kids were scared by it. Becky says it scared me. It doesn't have to be scary for adults. Go ahead.
When I was younger, I loved Scooby-Doo, but yeah, it did, like, scare some of the episodes, not all the episodes, but some of them did scare me, and my godson as well. He was obsessed with it, and the reason that he and I liked it was because it was a safe kind of scary. Like, it followed the same patterns. You always knew that it was going to turn out that it wasn't really supernatural, but still it had that kind of element, which is what kids horror does. You have that thrill of being scared, but you're not traumatized, you know?
Except by Escape from Zombie Island, which I think maybe was more traumatic.
Yeah.
It was more traumatic because we always, in the past, had it be just a guy in a mask.
Yes. Yeah, that one, there was a lot of complaints about that, funnily enough.
I'm sure. They even kind of subvert that beat where they're like, all right, let's just prove who it is. They go to pull the mask off, and they pull the zombie's head all the way off.
Yeah.
Shaggy, loses his absolute mind, as you might guess. Should have done. Maybe we could do a Tucker and Dale TV show. I love Tucker and Dale. I think there's a show there. Safe, kind of scary, fascinating. Yeah, that is an interesting idea.
Can I ask a question about horror shows and drama?
Sure.
So has there ever been, because there's like Twilight Zone, which is the more or less a new premise every episode, and then you have American Horror Story, which does one premise for about 10 episodes on average. Mm-hmm. Has there ever been like, and then you have totally serialized stuff like Ash vs. Evil Dead, but that's not really horror. That's more like comedy. It's not really scary at any point. Has there ever been like a horror show that's like deliberately serialized? Like there's a plot and there's a plot thread that might go on for like more than a season that you'd say was like legitimately effective at actually being scary?
Wait, the question is are there any... Go ahead.
Has there ever been like a fully serialized horror TV show that might have gone for like more than one season? With the same plot threads, it didn't have any resets, it didn't have like a new thing every time, and it like still stayed like effective at being scary.
Oh, so you mean like a premise show, which is a show with a much longer plot that every episode is just a chapter of that longer plot?
Yeah, pretty much. Because like
Right.
all the serialized shows I can think of that are like horror, they're usually like the comedies first and foremost. They don't really expect you to be like scared. They just flirt with the horror topic.
Got it. Yeah, absolutely. I want to talk about Marianne, this just is a nice transition to my next slide. Although Marianne did get canceled after one season, so I guess we can't exactly say it necessarily fits your criteria, but that was the intention, was that it would keep going forward, and it sets up lots of cliffhangers and plot threads for later. It is legitimately really scary, I think at least, and really gory. So let me give you some tips for making that work, and also think, maybe, does anyone else have other suggestions of shows that premise horror shows that you thought were scary all throughout? A lot of people I don't love Hannibal, but also a lot of people do love Hannibal. And that actually weirdly transitions from almost procedural into premise-based show by the end of the second season. In the chat, Luke says horror just doesn't tend to scare me. Okay, maybe not the best audience for this question. Go ahead.
X-Files might fall into that category where it can be consistently spooky, but it's also telling a serialized A plot. The B plot is the monster of the week, but there's a big A plot, like Mulder trying to find his abducted sister and all this kind of stuff. There's a big conspiracy they unravel. Maybe that works.
Yeah, that's another one that changes from procedural to premise over time as the conspiracies kind of expand in scope.
On that, then I'd also add, although not every episode is horror, the first 5 seasons of Supernatural were planned, as in every season after that was just like, because it was popular, they just like made up so very long. But the first 5 seasons were fully and utterly planned, with it leading up to the whole Dean and Sam's being vessels for Michael and Lucifer, and this big battle that would happen at the end. And so I think more of the sillier episodes were after that, because that kind of felt a lot more, and similar to X-Files, the Monster of the Week was like the B plot. They started with the first series with Monster of the Week, but even that, they're looking for their dad. The very first thing is Dad's gone on a hunting trip and he hasn't returned. And by the end of the series, they find their dad and there's a big accident. So it kind of has that. I was going to say to you, Conor, if you ever want to have a go at Supernatural, just the first 5 seasons. After that, it kind of went a bit. But yeah.
Oh, I know. I've seen enough of that. Amanda says Stranger Things is scary most episodes. Yeah, some people might not think. If you're a hardcore horror fan, you probably won't think so. But if you're not, you probably would. Anybody else want to suggest?
There's one
Go ahead.
on Netflix called Sweet Home that I haven't gotten too far into, but that might fit your criteria.
That is a Japanese show, I believe, or Korean. I think it's Korean, actually. About,
I think it's Korean.
Yeah, it's sort of about a monster invasion that mostly centers on this one apartment building, if I remember correctly. Okay, so there's a bunch of suggestions for you. I'll also throw out one more for you. 30 Coins on HBO. Pretty scary, pretty cool, pretty complicated plot. It's kind of along the lines of stuff like Hellboy. It has that cosmic horror, but also religious horror element, kind of like comparing and combining the two. Check out 30 Coins.
I just remembered which one. I think it's to answer that gentleman's actual question about a horror show that continues the premise into future seasons. There's a TV show called Evil,
Right.
which is... Yes, and you never really know whether it's... I mean, it's kind of confirmed now that it's real, but in the beginning you never really knew whether it was real or not.
Thought I had a slide.
As in,
there it is.
Supernatural stuff was real or not. But that covers... Yeah, there you go. That covers... That continues the same story in like future series. It doesn't like reset or have a different big bad at the end of every series. You know, the guy who they're trying to fight against, remains the like antagonist. You know,
Right.
he's just sort of, sometimes they're winning, sometimes they're losing. You know.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for weighing in, everybody. Okay, let me get through premise, and then we'll look at some engine elements, and I want to look at just 2 more pages from the screen pilot that kind of clarify how story engines work on TV. And then I do want to leave plenty of room for us to work on our own, or showcase and work on our own premises, and maybe do picture prompts if there's time. So let's look first at what can make a premise-based show work in the horror world on TV. This is a big question. So you have to consider a couple things. We mentioned this idea that you have a limited pool of characters. You can't constantly be introducing new ones every single episode, or else we'll just stop connecting to them, or we'll just expect them to die. So you need to kind of meter out the dreadful consequences a little more slowly. It's a tricky balance. You don't want to waste all your ammo in the first few episodes, but you also want to make sure the pilot is not holding the best stuff back. 30 Coins, I thought, did this brilliantly, where we kind of have a monster of the week that's connected to this bigger thing that's going on, but it doesn't hold back. Like, it escalates as much as a movie would. It feels like a movie. It works great with mystery and drama plot types, with lots of room for subplots and character development, which can add to that feeling of lulling the audience that we mentioned. The more time that you spend on non-scary subplots, the more that we kind of forget if they're compelling, if they're well done. If they aren't compelling and well done, then you're just boring us, obviously. So I often say, if you can't do good drama, just don't try. Like, bad drama is more harmful to your show than not trying to do good drama and focusing your skills on something else. You could do something in like a grindhouse type of tone if you want. We don't need good drama in a grindhouse type of tone world. You could do comedy if that's more of your thing. You know, you can find some other aspect there if drama is not your forte. Bad drama is really, really damaging to a story, especially horror. But in any case, yeah, it works great with mystery and drama. We can dig very deep into the characters over time, especially if we're using like multiple timelines or something like this, which in the Flanagan kind of mode of storytelling we often are. The story engine is usually centered around a common conflict that multiple characters are trying to solve, which expands in scope as we learn more. So I mentioned Marianne as the one of my favorite scary shows, and this one is about, there's a group of, so when they're teenagers, they do a seance and summon a ghost witch from a lighthouse. Bad idea, guys. And then it's the ghost witch kind of haunts them throughout the rest of their lives and keeps coming back in different ways. A little bit like It, right? It's keeps coming back in different ways, keeps trying to summon them back to their hometown, has like a weird relationship with them, considers them like my little pets or whatever. Also really cool fantasy rules and things like this. I love how it unfolds. And there's an awesome, really creative episode where we do interesting things with the timelines. Like the main characters are in a group and they get attacked by a dog. And as a result, they have to split up into 3 different groups that then we explore those 3 different timelines in like a fractured kind of structure. I love it. So there's some considerations for how to make premise work. You gotta hold back. You have to use a light touch sometimes, but then it's like you gotta use a light touch until you don't. Use a light touch until you gut punch us. But it can't be all gut punches. Tricky balance. And also, this concept in premise shows of anyone can die is often a really effective way to keep tension high. If it feels like you'll just preserve the characters through everything and they have plot armor, then we might lose a bit of investment, or we may not buy into the threat being that bad. Okay, let me take all questions on story engine elements and how horror works on TV in terms of continuity and format.
Is there a way to kill a character without killing them? Like bringing them back somehow, having their, I don't know, ghost is cliche, but how do you have dire life and death consequences happen to a character, but this still sort of keep them in the show?
Great question. Well, there's a couple ways. One, the echoes of that character's legacy, effect on the world, or something like that persist and continue to matter. Think of something like 13 Reasons Why. which is not horror at all.
Okay.
That's a drama. But it is about a girl that dies by suicide in the opening episode, but leaves a bunch of like audio logs for people to listen to that sort of put together a mystery that she's basically built for them to solve. So you could use that idea of like we're finding artifacts that were left behind by this character, or something some message that they were trying to send. Think of Jigsaw. Jigsaw's been dead since Saw 3. Sorry to spoil it, but there's 10 Saw movies. How do we keep Jigsaw alive? Well, we flash back. We involve his apprentices or proteges. We involve his schemes and plans that he had set into motion before his death, which I guess there are just hundreds of them. Like, I guess, are we just going to do it is Jigsaw's legacy just going to, like, he's been dead for 8 movies, and we're still going. Like, there's always a way to flash back to show some side story, although it will lead to weird things where, like in the last movie, wasn't that supposed to be set in 2004? Why are Amanda and Jigsaw clearly much older than, you know what I mean? Like, you do run into problems sometimes.
That's the Breaking Bad problem.
Yes,
you
the Breaking
just
Bad.
gotta suspend disbelief at that point.
The bald cap in the diner is what we're referring to at this point, which would be, yeah, when clearly it's way after the show is done and we go back to film additional material that was set earlier, the actors will look different. They just will. Season 5 of Stranger Things, they say they're going to digitally de-age the cast. That's how long they've taken to make season 5. Because otherwise,
I like that.
Will, you look like you're in your mid-30s by now. I'm sorry to say, but you just do.
Why don't they just make the show take place in the 90s or something? You know,
I think that's a great idea.
Move us forward.
I would do it.
Well, you can say like 10th year super seniors.
Right. Yeah, I would just have them age up. I think it's fine. But Stranger Things will never leave the 80s. When the show's over, the 80s will be over. But they're not going to leave the 80s. Wait for the spin-off. It'll be called Better Call Hopper. Can't Stop Hop? That's a good title. So, okay, that's good. Someone should do that.
Hop on Pop.
Come on. Copyright infringement. Go ahead.
I put a question in the chat, but I'll say it. Would you say it's harder to write a horror TV show than it is to write a horror film?
Yes, way harder. And that is because of that concept of picking up the or needing to worry about where do I pick up the pieces later. I mean, this could just be me personally, though. Like, I can only answer for myself. But all things considered, I think there are more complicating factors that go into writing, a horror show, because your goals are clashing with the constrictions, or the constraints and restrictions. I don't think constrictions would be the word to use here. The restrictions and constraints of the medium, being that we need high stakes, we need to fear for the characters, but also it needs to last a long time. Those things work against each other, right? So yeah, there's hurdles there that aren't there in movies. In movies, you don't need to worry about as much.
Yeah. I mean, there is that question, though, of where I'm writing kids' horror. And so, like, you instinctively know that the main character's not going to die. Because it's kids. You're not going to kill off the main character in a kids' show.
Mm-hmm.
So, what... In the book, it's easy, but if I'm talking about, like, I want to do, like, a kids' horror TV show with, like, a main character that's sort of investigating, how do I, like, have the stakes if we know the main character's not going to die?
Well, let's look at something like Scooby-Doo or
Mm-hmm.
Gravity Falls, right? Something like that, which is Gravity Falls a horror show? Not really exactly that much. There are spooky parts throughout, and the characters are scared. So, in a way, it has a lot in common. I would call this, the sort of mystery of the week type of show. You have to find things to threaten them with that are not their life or death, I guess. Or you could just threaten life or death, but we just know that they're not going to die, and that's fine, too. Like, the characters have to be afraid, I think, is a big key part of this. They can't be sure that they have plot armor, because if they are, then we won't be afraid at all. So you can absolutely still put your characters in mortal danger, even in a show like Gravity Falls or whatever, right? Or you could make the threat something else. Like, if you don't solve this mystery, you're never going to find out where your missing parent is. Or something like that, right? In which case, that's pretty high stakes and pretty visceral and pretty important, but just doesn't involve life or death. It doesn't need to.
Right, yeah.
So you can use a mix of those two approaches. I think most kids media does. Sometimes they are just in mortal danger and it's fine, and sometimes the stakes are something else, but something equally that feels equally important to the characters.
Cool.
Let's take other questions. Thoughts on horror TV or story engines, whatever we talked about today. Luke says, Hopper the Ghost Stopper. That's pretty good. Okay, that's good. Last episode of Agatha All Along was amazing. I've not seen that one yet. That one seems like a sort of, lighter horror fantasy kind of thing.
You definitely need to watch Agatha All Along. The last 2 episodes are Halloween. But I was actually going to private message you this. The last episode that we watched, so that's episode 6, 7, whatever. 7. You would absolutely love. Obviously, you've got to watch the whole series because it's a mystery. But what I really like about it is it reveals a lot of the things that we've already figured out earlier. It doesn't leave it for like a end of season twist, but also that one episode, I think you'd love it, Connor, because it plays with that whole aspect of non-linear storytelling.
Cool. Sounds good.
So, very cleverly written.
Yeah, Marvel
Jack
is
Schaefer's genius.
Marvel's doing a bit more with experimenting into horror, also with what was it called, Werewolf by Night on Disney Plus, which I thought was okay, but it had a cool style.
I like the style of that.
Yeah.
I don't think it's a surprise that the TV shows and films that are doing the best are the ones that have gotten lower budget because they're more risky. I personally think if Disney's going to survive, it needs to go back into taking risks. And I'd love to see a live action movie of The Black Cauldron. You want to talk about horror for kids? Mm-hmm. That's my favourite Disney movie. It really terrified me.
Yeah. Give it a couple years. We might. I think it was not a success financially, so it would be tough to convince people to, but
it wasn't.
But it's IP that people know, and so
time.
Yeah, it'll. I'm sure that someone's looking at it.
Are there horror shows from the perspective of the monster or the slasher villain or something like that?
Ooh, I'm writing one.
Are some, yeah. Go ahead. Was somebody talking?
Sorry, just wanted to brag. Yeah, I'm writing exactly that. Sorry.
No problem. Thanks for letting us know. Yeah, you can do it. You definitely can. The rules change a little bit because you have. So you're doing a villain protagonist, and we are following the villain in addition to what we might call normally the heroes of that sort of story, or your antagonists would then be people trying to stop the protagonist villain. Or you can do sort of anti-hero who is also him. Oh, like what's it called? Interview with a Vampire on AMC. You can do that sort of urban fantasy thing where it's like the main character, like it has a lot of horror elements to it, but largely we are in such a supernatural world that your main character might be a supernatural threat, but so is everyone else. You can do that. Like True Blood kind of has horror elements here and there, but it's largely, I would call dark urban fantasy. Yeah, you can definitely do it. Usually, though, when your character is the monster, then it's not played for horror as much as it is played for, like, coolness, like Angel or something like that, or like, any of these kind of Vampire Diaries type of shows like this. It's not really played for scares to the same extent. So it can be done. You just have to consider, what is my character afraid of? If your main character's not afraid, it's really hard to call it horror. So either there's a worse threat or something else. Go ahead.
Or you twist it where they're actually the victim. So a lot of the adaptations of Frankenstein's monster do that.
Even the
I guess
novel.
you could do everything with Spawn. He's the victim. There's threats that are supernatural that are bigger than him. There's also human threats, and he's also an anti-hero or a villain.
Yeah, misunderstood.
Yeah.
I love a really good misunderstood creature. Like, I love it when you get the Werewolf by Night is basically that, where you got these monsters and then it turns out no, actually they're the harmless ones who just can't control themselves, and it's humans that push them into it. Do you know what I mean? I love that concept. Right. Edward Scissorhands, I know it's not really horror.
No, but similar, yeah. Off that same idea that they're misunderstood, they're hunted by humans, and they're often also very sexy. It turns out in most of these stories. We love hooking up with the monster. Yes, there was a Spawn HBO cartoon, and I think they developed a live action that never got off the ground. And here's a question well, I'll come back to that in a second. Yeah, and Spawn is one of those examples of like such high fantasy that it's not grounded at all anymore, but it is still scary. Like the main character does have threats that are worse than him. So yeah, you have to have like, and it also has an action element to it. The main character is a badass that can summon swarms of guns and chains and stuff like that. So it's hard to say that it's like traditional grounded horror, but it's got scary parts, absolutely. Maybe Constantine is a better example of that kind of dark urban fantasy with horror elements where the main character is competent, but he's more outmatched. He doesn't have like swarms of guns. Or Hellboy, yeah, exactly. Hellboy has lots of scary elements, but he himself is not that afraid of them. He is sometimes, but more often than not, it's about how he's like, hey, ugly, take a piece of this, punch the giant scary thing in the face. But you have more vulnerable characters on his team inside.
I got a good example, Death Note.
Sure.
We were following essentially a slasher villain in Death Note.
I haven't seen Death Note, but I think I know the basics of the plot. That is about a teenager that finds a magic notebook that allows him to kill anyone that he writes down their name, like with no connection to him. They just die, I guess, of like a heart attack or something. And
then he becomes the world's most prolific serial killer, basically.
Right, and there's like a cop hunting him down.
A detective, yeah.
Right. Yeah, there you go. That's a villain protagonist where we sort of have like the villain who has good motivations, but he goes too far. And so then we are sort of rooting against him in a way, but it's like that anti-hero thing where you're kind of rooting for him at the same time. It can work. I wonder if Death Note is scary, though. Is it?
There are some scary elements or moments, but it's more of a thriller.
Right. Supernatural thriller.
You can make it a horror.
Right. You could easily play it as horror. I think the live-action movie probably did a little more, though. Everyone seemed to hate it. I never saw it. Here's a couple questions from Amanda. One, is Supernatural dark urban fantasy? Yeah, I would say so. Supernatural's everything. I mean, it's everything in the kitchen sink, which we talked about as almost its own kind of subgenre. You've got sci-fi stuff, you've got angels and demons, you've got ghosts, you've got vampires. It's everything. Lock and key, dark urban fantasy with horror elements. Yeah, for sure. Okay, looks like that's all the text questions. Anyone else want to speak up, weigh in before we move to looking at your guys' ideas, brainstorming, and prompts, horror TV show prompts? Okay, let's, before we dive in, let's just look at my last pages here, then we'll look at your guys, so get your stuff ready if you want to share. Alright, so the last few pages clarify the story engine. Let's go back to screen, and let's remember that almost every horror show, the pilot ends with something like this. Because the last couple pages are usually, our characters may have wrapped up the first chapter of their journey or whatever, but it makes a great time to remind us, oh yeah, this is a show. This isn't over. There's so many mysteries that we've only glimpsed like a sliver of them, and there's more to come, and you should keep watching, and you will be rewarded by continuing to watch, by learning the answers to these other questions, or figuring out what that thing is, or who was the person in the wall, or what was that curse, or, like, you want to learn more. You have to prove that there's track left to go down. Okay, let's just read this one. Don't even worry about the plot. Let's just look at what happens here, and remember that most shows end with something like this. Bates Motel has a similar ending. Audrey adds new photos to her collage on the wall, an eerie Polaroid of the moonlit lake, a video still of Emma laughing and pushing the camera away by the pool, and finally, a clipping that has of that haunting, blurry image of Brandon James. And Noah, again, is our sort of meta character, kind of like Jamie Kennedy's character from the original movies. He tells us, everyone has secrets. Everyone tells lies. Our next scene is grim-faced Jake opens a folder on his computer and presses select all, and moves a large group of video files to his trash can. His finger hovers over the mouse, but he can't resist. Jake double-clicks a file and sees a video clip of Nina undressing in her bedroom. The same POV as the Snapchat images from the opening, taken from her own webcam. Jake's eyes feast on Nina for a moment, then he moves the files to the trash and dumps them. In Noah's car, a creepy heartbeat fades up as we reveal that Noah is alone in his car, parked on a quiet street, talking, presumably to Riley on his cell phone. That's telling us that we can't. His dialogue is inaudible, so there's probably music over top of it. We're in montage mode. Everyone is fair game. We're getting all the cues that Noah's going to be the next to die. The music, the eerie solitude of the location, his own nerdy confidence that he knows exactly how this all works. And he tells us, until there's no one left. The heartbeat stops. Noah looks up at the rearview mirror, seemingly at us, and pushes his hair out of his eyes, leaving a bloody smear across his forehead. Ooh, another little twist to reveal us. We want to end with this promise that, oh, you gotta see why that happened, or what that meant, or what's gonna happen next. So the last few pages do a lot towards clarifying how your engine is going to work. They remind us that it's a show, and they tell us what the rules are, what the scope is, and what's important. What should we care about? Okay, we're going to share student work, and I just will take one question first. Also, if there's time, I don't know how many people want to weigh in, but I do have a couple picture prompts. And that's when we have just a picture as inspiration. You come up with an idea for a show based on that. Just riff it off the top of your head. And then maybe we'll throw some curveballs at you in terms of, now reimagine it, but it's this. Now reimagine it, but it's that. It doesn't have to be perfect. This is all just practice coming up with workable premises. Okay, so let's open it up. Who would like to... oh, wait, sorry, I was going to take this first question. Are there specific things that you think an engine should have when writing a Monster of the Week with an overarching plot that you maybe wouldn't have to think about with a straight-up serial structure without a Monster of the Week element? Sure. So, if you're writing a Monster of the Week show with an overarching plot, then you need a sense of progress of some kind. That's what's going to separate just Thing of the Week from that premise structure that you're talking about, the overarching plot. So maybe, do we have a list of monsters to check off? Could work well, right? Or do we have a list of locations that we need to secure? Or do we have, like, that sort of idea of a map, a list, or some way of visualizing what the grander journey of this is becomes really useful. And so it could be that you're working in a travel-based story where your characters are trying to get from point A to point B, and will understand each monster they encounter as, like, an episodic encounter on the way. Like, Last of Us is basically tragedy of the week in a post-apocalyptic road trip type story. So you can definitely do that, but you have to have that sense of forward momentum, and like we're checking things off, like we're accomplishing something, we're gaining ground, we're working towards some kind of end game. So a consistent antagonist might be useful. You might want to somehow otherwise just clarify that we're fighting the same fight the whole time. It's not a bunch of completely unrelated conflicts. Hope that helps. Thank you for the great question. All right, let's open the floor to anyone who wants to share, brainstorm, ask questions, or tell us about your horror show premises for feedback. So remember, if you don't need feedback, you don't need to share.
I kind of like to share.
Go for it.
Okay, so this is loose, so bear with me. So my project is called Just Happy to Be Here. Happy to Be Here is a horror anthology. Well, after we spoke, I don't know, after that whole presentation, I don't know about anthology, but I'll just keep reading. It's a horror anthology illustrating the lives of the entertainment industry's backbone, the production worker. The events of this series will be horrific retellings loosely based on real-life events. Intended to be a limited series, the anthology will eventually combine to make one overarching storyline a la Magnus Archives. Are you familiar with the Magnus Archives?
Oh, sorry.
Okay, so it's basically, long story short, it starts out as Monster of the Week and then eventually molds together like, oh, these things are connected. You know what I mean? So that's what I'm trying to do, basically. Our main character, Neve, is a remote worker for a big name entertainment company. She's like freshly out of college. She's so bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. She gets her equipment sent to her and is so excited to start. At her job, they're test using a state-of-the-art remote work VR called RITS, Remote Interactive Televisual System. It's used to, quote-unquote, see people in person, but sometimes there are abstractions and anomalies. She is socially punished subtly for pointing these things out, but as it turns out, these so-called harmless errors are more real than any of them know. Like, consider the back rooms. You know how there's monsters in the back rooms and stuff like that. Yeah. So that's that's the long and short of what I'm working on.
Didn't you say these are based on true stories?
So it's based on my actual experience as a remote worker, and every time like something goes wrong and I'm like, hey, this is going on, there's like subtle punishment. So it's fantastical and supernatural in terms of like what happens in the VR and how, you know, the stakes get higher and it gets more dangerous, but it's very fantastical. It's very like
then these
retelling.
Are not, okay, these are not like, based on true stories. This is just inspired by your experience in the industry?
Yes.
Oh, okay,
yes.
Okay.
And
big difference. Big difference.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Okay.
Based on true stories would mean these events. They don't like, you can kind of lie and cheat. Like we've seen this a million times. Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The Conjuring is allegedly based on true events and stuff like that, right? But
right.
If it's just taking inspiration from the world of work that you're into, that's like a totally different thing. So I wouldn't tell people it's based on true stories. It's a little misleading. Okay, so
okay.
You were saying it's an anthology, so that's only the storyline and main character of the first episode?
No, so the more like after hearing you talk, I'm like not sure about anthology. I just want it to be seemingly like Tales of the Crypt, like you spoke about, how it's seemingly different things. Like this person is experiencing this anomaly, this person is experiencing that anomaly, and then it turns out like these things are related. You know what I mean?
Got it. Okay, so my suggestion to you then is that has to be in the pilot. If it's not in the pilot, it's not. You got nothing. Like that's the tricky thing here. The pilot has to be a representative sample of what the rest of the show will be. So like the show, like if you say, okay, for the first couple episodes, none of which I'm going to get to write, it would be this, but then it would change fundamentally, and that we would realize that these things were connected, but way down the line in the part of the show I haven't written yet, then you haven't really sold your vision of the show. So I think I would make your choice. You can do an anthology, or you can do a show where things are linked and connected, but you have to kind of clarify which one you're doing, and commit to that instead. So I would seed that into your pilot, or make it clear how your engine is going to clarify, especially in those last few pages. Like after your main character solves this backroom sort of dilemma, what's the next thing going to be? Is it going to be something else supernatural that happens to her, or does she become a detective who's like, I'm going to help other people solve their supernatural problems, or something like that? It just has to be clear how we're going to get to the next episode, and like we want to have a pilot is two things. One, it's a self-contained story. Two, it is an advertisement for a theoretical show. And it has to be an accurate advertisement for that show.
Okay, totally, that makes sense. Because she's a production worker, like I was, and so definitely, if something goes wrong with what she has to do because there's an anomaly, it will be on her to fix it, and she has to assist other people, so that can weigh into like.
Oh, okay. So she's on like different sets every episode.
Yeah, or she's a remote worker, so everything kind of has to happen in the VR, which is part of the theme, like loneliness or whatever. Well, that's further down the road.
It's kind of constrict, isn't it? Kind of that's like feels like a really restrictive element to your plot, though. Like, shouldn't your main character, unless there's some brilliant reason why you want her working from home the whole time, like, wouldn't it be a little more dynamic to have your character actually on set? Like sometimes even remote workers like DIT and things like that, they do go to set.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe it could be like hybrid.
Yeah, it could be hybrid, especially if they do some work. They do some work at home. They do some work on set, but you need to maybe deliver stuff to and from set. That often happens.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. I wanted it to be her being remote matters because it's like based on remote work experience, but I do see what you're saying about the set or like the stage being like a little bit limited if we're just remote the entire time.
Yeah, especially if you're saying, well, she has like a VR work setup or something like that. It's like you had to introduce a whole other technology and plot element just to make it make sense and make your show work. I would say you maybe don't need that thing, or maybe that could be part of the plot of your first episode if there's a VR plot line. But you don't need that as a unifying element to make the show work at all. I think you can just say she's going to different sets, and maybe is there some other unifying thing happening that connects what's going on here? Are there like a series of cursed productions going on, or like are they all? Is she assisting people that are making one TV show, like different episodes of that same show, or something like that? Maybe think of what else could kind of unify things as you're moving from thinking about it as anthology to thinking about it as more contiguous in terms of story.
Totally. Thank you.
No problem. Cool idea, though. I love, behind the scenes kind of like Hollywood stuff. I think that's great. Doesn't get explored very much on TV or movies. Okay, thanks for that. Hope that was useful. Let's reopen the floor. Who else would like to talk about that? Wasn't Amanda here to do this? Didn't she leave?
Can I quickly ask something?
Yeah, go ahead.
So, obviously you know that for my children's book, I'm doing children's horror, and I'm doing like paranormal and supernatural stuff in that. My first book is about ghosts. But I also had an idea and I want to do like horror for kids as a TV show, and I had this idea of like a school that's training kids to be ghost hunters. So, like I said to you about the real estate, where every episode is them like solving a ghost thing. This would be almost like Lockwood and Co. with like each thing being dealing with a ghost, except it's not in that kind of world where ghosts are just sort of commonplace. It's more kind of secretive and what have you. But like, even if I don't go with that, how do you write similar concepts? Like you say, Mike Flanagan's got his own sort of style.
Yeah.
And yet each of his series feels very distinct, but they're all about the same stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you like keep your worlds separate, as it were? Otherwise people just go, oh, it's just an extension of this, oh, it's just writing this story again.
So do you mean from a perspective of from work to work, how do you keep your style consistent, or do you mean from episode to episode?
How do I make it distinct from work to work? Because I'm dealing with ghosts, and ghosts already have a certain lore about them. So the rules of the world are kind of half written by what people's thoughts on what ghosts are anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So how do I make each distinct?
Okay, how do you make your work distinct even though it's playing on the same themes and subject matter? Great question. So the rules don't have to work the same way every time. In fact, if you radically shake up the rules, you can get very different stories. I think ghosts are at their best when every time we see them, they do something that makes sense with what we know about them, but we haven't seen them do before in that story. And so, in some, ghosts are very sympathetic, especially in the kind of like Guillermo del Toro kind of storytelling mode. The ghosts are almost always not the villains. They are misunderstood, or like they are trying to warn people of some human threat or something like that. In The Devil's Backbone, Crimson Peak, things like this. In some stories, the ghosts are vicious murderers, and they want to hurt and kill you because they can, and they're evil or something like that. In some stories, ghosts haunt a place, and some they haunt a person, and some they can possess people. They can do different things. You can evoke different themes using those different rules. So I'd say, one, change up the rules. Shake them up. Shake up the expectations. Take a different tone. You could have one story about ghosts that's really sad and tragic and tearjerker haunting of Hill House kind of thing. You could have one that is a hilarious romp. You could have one that is like, I don't know, an action-packed, like The Matrix, but with ghosts. That'd be cool, wouldn't it? So you can pick like almost a different sort of genre to blend with, or a different genre spin on even the same subject matter every time. So yeah, mix up the tone, mix up the rules, and mix up your influences, I would say. Or try drastically changing the setting, too. That can do a lot.
Cool. That does help, because obviously my book there is very sympathetic. I mean, ghosts can turn poltergeisty, but they tend to be more, they're harmless. Whereas if in the TV show I'm making these kids hunt ghosts, they are going to be, the ghosts are going to be dangerous, sort of supernatural style. Then I guess the question is, ghosts, there's like that they're in everything, but then you get people say, or I'm already thinking, is this too similar to like Lockwood and Co? It's like I don't know. It's horror is so ubiquitous. It was the first like cinema genre, pretty much horror and comedy, musicals. When sound came in, like how do you not let it get overwhelming that there's so much out there that you can pretty much say everything is like something else?
Well, the audience is voracious for this material. They don't care. They love it. We kind of, maybe that's part of the comfort aspect to it, is that we do know what to expect and we sign up to get that thing that we expect. Horror audiences are famous for, why do you think it's so profitable? The audience will see anything. They're so desperate for this that they will even watch the bad stuff and buy and rewatch the bad stuff that they're like, this movie sucks. I've seen it 100 times. You know, like horror fans, more than almost anyone will do that and are willing to take that leap for you. We're looking for such a specific emotional experience, and there's only one real way to get it, which is, or I guess there's like, you can be scared by other genres, but like there is one consistent way to get that, you know, uncut hit of the good stuff. So yeah, I would just say don't worry about you distinguishing your work way too much. You can take influence or inspiration, or maybe create your work in response to other works in some way, and say like, I'm gonna maybe take some aspects of that, and move them both in different directions, and then like even a small change would be enough. You have to imagine the audience would have even been happy with a like they would have been happy with even less than you're trying, in terms of originality,
Right.
most of the time.
Yeah, cool. Thank you.
Sure. I think a lot of what comes down to effective horror writing is knowing the audience really well. I see some questions from the chat that I do want to take. Thank you for that, Nacho. Okay, so a question from Askia Idru. Are you still streaming? Yes, we are. Hi, we did have to break this video into two pieces, though, because we had a glitch halfway. Sorry about that. Another question from Mellow and Tears. The best way to write a horror show is to unnerve a person truly. Stuff like Hannibal or Terrifier is icky, but true horror is familiar. Like, what's more horrifying than an abusive father? Examples include Gerald's Game, Midsummer. Yeah, I think It is another great example of this, how we have, like, a really fantastical threat in this evil cosmic horror clown man, but also a lot of the horror comes from very personal things because the clown sort of preys on and amplifies human evil. So, like, you know, Beverly's abusive father, for instance, or, like, the creepy adults all throughout Derry and the way that they ignore or downplay the problems. The people are just as creepy, or the kid with the knife, like, there's the people are just as creepy, or like the mundane things are just as creepy as, you know, they are tied into the horror, but they also exist separate from it. So yeah, you can definitely bring that relatability and groundedness to the audience. It becomes difficult to fully ground ourselves in a story where not very much is familiar at all. Like, that's why you don't see as much fantasy or sci-fi horror as you do more grounded stuff. Also, that is linked to the cost of creating those things, of course. Okay, let's reopen the floor. We've got about 5-10 minutes left. Anybody else want to share info, questions about their horror projects? I think we won't have time for picture prompts, but that's okay.
Is it okay if I go?
Go ahead.
So this is kind of my baby, and I know you generally advise against bringing your babies onto here, but the premise being it's action horror specifically, with my goal being to both make, you know, the action compelling and the horror actually scary. God help me. I have a specific question. Part of the premise is that, you know, in most horror shows, you're generally following somebody who is initially at least somewhat defenseless, or they're unprepared for the threat. I'd like to make a show that's like in the vein of Ash vs. Evil Dead or something like that. The characters are like actively prepared. They're fully aware that they're like going to the belly of the beast, and they are capable of like actually pushing back against the horror. It doesn't mean they, you know, win, not necessarily, but they have, you know, a legitimate chance against the monster.
Mm-hmm.
The problem I kind of have with this is the way that you can keep it scary initially, like top of my head, just make the monster like more overwhelmingly powerful than them, right? You know, maybe guys have a shotgun, then you're fighting like some sort of an eldritch god or whatever, right? That's not really something you can immediately just shoot out of the way. But that kind of invites power creep, right? You know, like with Dragon Ball Z or something like that, or a lot of like animes where you have really powerful characters and they get more and more powerful every episode or every season. So you have to keep like ass pulling bigger and bigger threats until it kind of loses pretty much all tangibility. I guess if my goal is to make a show where the characters can actually fight back, but I'd like to at least keep elements of it like legitimately scary. What are some ways of doing that while, you know, without just making the monster, you know, this, you know, increasingly powerful, omnipotent threat to the point where it just kind of desensitizes the audience?
Great question. Okay, so you mentioned power scaling, and this is the idea that as your protagonists continue to mount up victories or gain abilities or powers, you have to thus increase the power of the villains in order to stay menacing to them. And this is why action horror is such a tricky... So you're writing an action horror TV show, which is an extra, 3 layers of trickiness. You're doing, a 720 kickflip while, juggling. But that's cool. That's fine. I love when, you can choose a project based on the challenge. So, the issue you're dealing with is that your characters have to be competent in order to survive. They have to score victories against the opponents, but also you want them to remain feeling overwhelmed and vulnerable. Do I have that right?
Yes.
Okay. So the way you can do, there's a couple ways you can do this. One, we are constantly on the back foot, constantly overwhelmed, constantly one step behind the enemy. You don't have to keep scaling up the villains more and more to make them one step ahead, right? So make the villains more clever, not bigger and scarier. Or they will be, in a sense, scarier because they are more clever. Also, enemies that learn from what has happened before. So the earlier defeats will actually give their wins for the other side, and now the other side is adapting to what they've done in the past, so they can't just keep doing the same thing. You have to imagine if your characters are like, oh, we have silver bullets, we can kill the werewolves now, right? But, then the werewolves start wearing armor? So now what do we do? So maybe think of that level of escalation, where we're not escalating bigger and bigger, we are escalating in response to a tactic that has worked in the past. I think some examples of this that work really well are the Borg in Star Trek, and the agents from the Matrix, which both kind of have this element of you can't just keep beating them the same way. So there's one thing that would really help. Another thing is big losses. So although your characters can have victories here and there, because even surviving against... you can also frame victory as meaning several different things. To begin with, think of Dunkirk's tagline, victory is survival, or survival is victory. You could always play it as the characters barely succeed, they barely survive, but they do succeed and survive, but we feel like we really earned it and there was a heavy cost associated with it, which means that you probably have to have big losses and big tragedies and some plans that completely fall apart and don't work and end in disaster and big character deaths, even in the pilot. And then maybe let's think of what's one more thing you could do here. So we have more clever villains, villains that escalate in a reactive and adaptive way. We have the one I just mentioned where your characters are losing my train of thought. Sorry, I'm just trying to land on one more tip for you, because I like to have 3. It feels good to have 3 tips in a row.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
No problem. So I think the last thing... it would probably have different conflicts of different scales and stakes going on. If every single fight is a life or death battle, then unless you're killing characters all the time, then we will stop buying into the threat posed by those battles, as you've probably been running into. So you have other conflicts going on in your subplots that are not necessarily shooting guns at each other till one side is dead or the other side is dead. You may have to find other sort of avenues of conflict for your characters to go down, which can still have scares. Imagine that we're going to go to the library, do research sequence. That makes a great scare sequence. Even though it's not it doesn't have to be a direct confrontation between your hero and villain. You may need more ways for your hero and villains to interact. Think of Pennywise, for instance. He's not always showing up as a clown, grabbing the kid and eating them. Often he'll be like, I'm going to send a sort of hallucination of your worst fear at you. Or I'm going to manipulate the school bully to come and kill you with a knife, or something like that, right? You have more versatile villains that are able to escalate their plans in different ways. There we go. 3 little tips. Hope that helps. Does that, was that along the lines you were thinking?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm certain it's going to do this shit, but thank you. This helps a long way.
Awesome. Great question. Thank you for that. Somebody drives motorcycles very fast outside my window, and they wanted me to know it. Okay, let's look at... I think we have a log line to look at, and maybe we'll wrap up with that one from Vivian. Are you there, Vivian? Can't talk. How am I going to give you feedback? Maybe you can answer... Can you type at least? Can you answer questions that way? Maybe I'll have to just ask a short question. Okay, so let's read it out. It's called State of Affair, horror comedy. Comps are regular show and Courage the Cowardly Dog. It sounds a bit more like a comedy in a horror setting, just from those comps. Series logline. Monster of the Week at the State Fair. Not sure the series logline. Okay, so we're not even at the logline stage yet. You're trying to figure out what your logline could be. That's all right. Monster of the Week at the State Fair. Okay, so who's the... So the hook might come in terms of the main character. What is the main character's responsibilities or their way of addressing threats? Are they the person that solves problems at the fair, and if so, in what way? Maybe the ensemble is part of your hook, if like the characters are all kind of like carnies or something like this that unifies them in terms of their job, like they're trying to keep the fair running smoothly. Maybe the series logline would be more like, a series of carnies must keep the fair running smoothly despite attacks by werewolves, vampires, and everything else, or something like that, right? Maybe there's also a more specific goal. If you're saying it's Monster of the Week, I would guess that the goal is to keep the carnival running, but maybe there's something else going on, or like, is there some mystery we're trying to ultimately unravel, or something like that? And then, what else do I want to say about this one? Yeah, is there some sort of consistent source of all the threats, even if that source is the place they are? I think carnivals travel. Most of the state fairs travel around, so I would think maybe there isn't a place in common between them, but I would maybe ask, what is attracting all the horrors to the fair? That might kind of help clarify the hook, too. Hope that helps. Anything you want to ask about that one that you can type in the Discord chat? He says it's an ensemble cast. The goal is to keep the state fair running, but there is an overarching story. Okay, so I would clarify, who is your ensemble cast? A group of carnies, teenagers, and, the popcorn salesman, whatever it is, maybe just give us a sense of who is in your ensemble. Must keep the fair running through blank, blank, and blank. Oogler tells us it could be Hannibal's situation. The fair travels to remote places, and those places usually happen to have supernatural stuff. Oh yeah, maybe you frame it as fairs do go to sort of backwoods places a lot, maybe as a result of the fact of where they end up gravitating. Those places just have creepy things going on. That could make sense. Hannibal, I think, at least has the excuse of Will Graham. His specialty is serial killers, so it makes sense why he's traveling around the country to find only the very worst of the very worst killers in every single episode. It's not like they all take place in the same town. He says the place where the fair is a hotbed for paranormal activity. Okay, that's cool. So maybe in that case it's not a traveling state fair. It actually does just stay in one place, or they travel around a county or something like that. Maybe that could unify the premise a little more. We do have to start wrapping up as we're over time, but hope that helps. Thank you for sharing that. He said I didn't think about the fact that fairs travel. Yeah, they pack up everything. They can do it quite quick, and they move around all over the place. They're not year round. Thank you guys for joining. Hope this gave you some useful, fun info on writing horror on TV. This is one of my favorite topics, but it was a brand new presentation, so we're always figuring these things out and learning as we go and refining and changing these things as we address them for the first time. I do want to just draw your attention to... there we go. Do I not have a slide that tells us what's coming up? Maybe... I guess I don't have a slide that has the upcoming schedule, but check the events tab in our Discord to see all the classes and events happening. And our 2 bootcamp slots are on Friday 6 to 8, which is currently features, and TV is Sundays 11 to 1, which is this slot. But those will swap once those bootcamps conclude, and series will move to Friday, features will move to Sunday. We have plenty more events this weekend, including Table Read today at 2 p.m. And several groups at like 5 and 6. We have poetry, we have short story, fantasy, lots of stuff on weekends. All right, thanks so much, guys. Hope to see you soon.